welcome to the new school and to this fabulous program. My name is Fabio Parasecoli. I'm the coordinator of food studies here at the new school, and I'm very glad to welcome you all to this event that we organized together with the Nutrition, Food Studies, and Public Health Department at New York University and with the Southern Food and Beverage Museum. We're very happy. The topic, clearly, it's of interest. We're very happy about the turnout. But before introducing our moderator, Liz Williams, I would like to say a couple of words of what we do here. So we started this program back in 2008. But in the past couple of years, it's been growing really fast. We offer classes for undergraduate students, but all our classes are also open to the general public. So if you're interested in any topics that range from history to politics, to history, to communication related to food, look at our catalog. We welcome everybody to our classes. Also, if you're interested in these topics, we have a website called The Inquisitive Eater, and it's inquisitiveeater.com. And we welcome submissions from anybody, not just people from the university. Actually, we designed it so that it's a hub for people to exchange ideas, to publish their material. We want it to be lively, and seriously, we'll be more than happy to have also your reflections about topics like this one. Last but not least, we have a series of events. The next one is going to be on September 27th for the 20 years of the Food Network. So we'll have some of the founders that are going to tell us about the beginnings. Of course, the Food Network has changed a lot since when it started, but that's part of why the topic is interesting. And then on October 3rd, we're going to have an event on the impact of climate change on farming. And that's an event of a series that we call the Educated Eater that we organize with Grow NYC, the organization that manages most of the green markets here in New York City. At any rate, if you're interested in our events, you can add yourselves to our new school food studies group, and automatically you will receive the invitations, or you can leave your email, and we'll make sure to send you an announcement on upcoming events. Now I want to introduce Liz Williams. She is the founder and president of the Southern Food and Beverage Museum in New Orleans. It's a great place. We had a meeting as Association of the Study of Food and Society down there. It's extremely interesting, but what they're doing, they're trying to also increase their activities in many directions, and maybe she can tell us a little bit, and she will also introduce all the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabio. And I also want to welcome all of you here. It's really exciting to be here. And I want to have a special thanks to all of the people from the new school who have been so supportive, and also Khalila Jaffe from the NYU has been very, very supportive. Let me tell you just a minute's worth of information about the Southern Food and Beverage Museum. The Southern Food and Beverage Museum opened in June of 2008 in New Orleans. And when we told people we were doing this, one of the things they said to us was, oh, there isn't one already? Because people just identify New Orleans with eating and food so much. But there wasn't one. And so for the past 5 years, we have been gathering artifacts, developing programs, really learning all sorts of things. And we realized that even though we were the Southern Food and Beverage Museum, we were something more than that. So we renamed ourselves the SoFAB Institute because we wanted to be like the Smithsonian of food. And this way, not only will we have a Southern Food and Beverage Museum, but eventually there'll be other kinds of food and beverage museums around the country. So we started collecting beyond just the South. But the first one is actually going to be the Southern Food and Beverage Museum in the South. And we've closed. We are in storage as we are getting ready to move into our own building. When we opened, we were in a mall, and now we're moving into our own building, which is really, really exciting because we are not affiliated with any particular institution. We're not under the umbrella of anybody. So we're just kind of making it on our own with our cobbled together finances and all that sort of thing. One thing that's very exciting, besides this program, that's about to happen is that on October 30th, we are opening our culinary library. So it's not as big as many, many other libraries, but we're starting with 11,000 volumes. We have a huge number of community cookbooks. We have pamphlets. We have many other archival materials. We have thousands of menus. And so our books are something that we treat like artifacts so that we're going to become almost a repository and not like a circulating library or a library that has geographic limits on how much space it has. So we will eventually, we hope, be really the place to come to do some kind of research, culinary research. And of course, we also collect things about drinking, so it's not all about food. And we have the Museum of the American Cocktail within our walls. Okay, so now let's talk about this question. We decided that we were going to pick a topic every year and we would explore it around the country. And then in October, we would have the culmination of that in some kind of a talk in New Orleans. So this year, our question was, is food art? And of course, we are looking to have a little controversy. We hope everyone doesn't have the same opinion. There are so many questions that are raised by this issue. We can go back to the French Enlightenment and talk about the question of eating as art as well as preparing food as art. We can talk about the more Hindu approach where art is a relationship between the artist and the observer, whether that person is a listener or a watcher or a consumer. There are so many ways to look at art. One thing that we have to remember, though, especially as we talk about the topic as it relates to food, is that we talk about people having good taste. And we don't mean that people taste good. What we mean is that taste, that sense, that thing that really covers all 5 of our senses, is the thing that we apply to other things outside of ourselves, which we often call art. So the question is, why do we use a word like that when we are talking about something like painting or music or literature? But until we start examining this question, are we talking about food? There are many ways to look at it. Food in art, food as art, all of those questions are, I think, things that we'll be talking about today. So I'm fortunate enough to be able to say what I want and then move on. And I'm going to introduce our illustrious panel, and I will do it as we go through here. So first, we have Fabio Parasecoli, am I right? Okay. Fabio Parasecoli, who is professor and coordinator of the Food Studies program here at the New School. You've already heard from him. And then we also have, I want to make sure that I credit everyone properly, Michael Laiskonis, who is the creative director at the Institute of Culinary Education. Then we have Yael Raviv, who is the director of the Umami Food and Art Festival. We have Nino Andonis, who is a food photographer on both coasts. And we have Lauren Carter Grimm and Joe Grimm, both artists and craft brewers with Grimm Artisanal Ales. So I'm going to turn this over to Fabio. The question, just in case you don't remember, is food art?
So I've been giving some thought about the topic in the past few years. Of course, the question and the answer of the question depends on what we think art is. And here I have people that can speak to very different aspects of it. I would like to talk about how, somehow, cuisine, especially high-end cuisine, what sometimes is called haute cuisine, might resemble as art as a field of social activity. I've been working on a series of documentaries that have come out in the past few years about chefs. You might have seen some of them. Maybe you've seen Jiro Dreams of Sushi, or you've seen 3 Stars. In the past few years, there's been really quite a number of these documentaries. And they deal with the chef as they would deal with an artist. What do I mean by that? First of all, it appears that creativity and innovation become 2 of the main traits for the chef. For the chef to come to a certain level, they have to be creative, they have to be innovative, they have to do new things. We expect the chef to know the classics, know their skills and their craft, but at the same time, we want them to explore. We want them to stimulate us. So in a way, from that point of view, they are, in a way, represented in those documentaries, but also we talk about chefs, especially high-end chefs, as if they were artists. And I've been working on this topic and see the language that is used to talk about chefs and artists, the visual representations. And there are some similarities there. Also from the more practical point of view, artists need a market, otherwise they starve. Of course, it's nice, we have this bohemian image of the starving artist. I think no starving artist loves to be starving. And how does the market works? Who are the buyers? Who are the patrons? Who gives money for artists to develop what they do? In a way, it's a similar problem that we have also in haute cuisine. Of course, in cuisine, we have investors. And especially in a place like New York, but also in big cities like, I don't know, Toronto. Now I'm thinking of Toronto because David Chang opened there recently, but you can think of any big center in the world. You need investors, but you also need clients, you need patrons. So how do you create a relationship between the chef and the patron so that the patron becomes sort of not an investor, but somebody, with their presence in the restaurant, help them continue do what they want. And at that point, it becomes a little complicated because, yes, we do want chefs to stimulate us. We want chefs to explore if we want to put them at that level. But at the same time, chefs are entrepreneurs. So to which point they can push in their experimentation without pushing the customers away. That's sort of a balancing act that maybe differentiate a little bit haute cuisine from art, but to a certain point. Again, also artists want to sell. So I'm going to stop here now because I want also the others to give their point of view. But for me, the important element is how do the 2 fields, as fields of social activity, look like each other, and how are they different?
Sir?
Yep.
All right. So, for me, this question of food and art, it kind of starts to occupy this interesting intersection of cooking, art, but also science, and that's kind of one of my areas of focus these days is looking at the underlying science of cooking. And I really love these quotes from Hubble, the astronomer. And I especially like the second one because all you have to do is put a G in front of astronomy, and we have gastronomy. Obviously, the reason why we're here is because food has become this intellectual topic, and that's just further exemplified by this quote from a great anthology called Eating Architecture. I'm also really interested in sort of the analogies between cooking and applied arts like architecture. So on gastronomy, I think Briat-Severin, he actually gave it a sort of a scientific definition, as much as he did in this book from the 1820s. He also applied an almost a philosophy towards eating. Of course, he was the one who gave us the quote, "You are what you eat," or "Tell me what you are. Tell me what you eat, I'll tell you what you are." But my favorite from that book is, "A meal without cheese is like a beautiful woman with only one eye." Interestingly, I found this from Escoffier, who was the chef who pretty much codified what French cuisine is in the early 1900s. And he equated cooking with as both an art and a science, which I thought was interesting. I think our current sort of fascination of cooking and science, it's cyclical. Escoffier was talking about it 100 years ago. So for me, this intersection, I've recently started thinking about it in this way, by using modern technology, modern cooking techniques, for instance, say sous vide cooking. What we're able to do with sous vide cooking is, say, cook a protein at the temperature that we want the final temperature to be. For instance, if I'm cooking a duck breast, I want it to be medium rare. I'm cooking it at exactly 57 degrees Celsius. It might take 3 hours until the core gets to 57 degrees Celsius. But in a sense, I've taken away the intuition of cooking that over fire and having to poke it and kind of get a sense of when it's medium rare. So in a way, I kind of feel like that, taking that intuition out of the cooking kind of allows us to divert it towards more creative aspects. Then for me, creativity implies that there's some sort of intent, there's some sort of inspiration. And through that, it gives us now this new ability to create a dialogue, not only with our ingredients, but with the guests. We're able to control the dining experience, both physiologically, how you physically eat something, but also creating an opportunity to engage emotion. As a pastry chef in particular, I've always thought that we have an interesting opportunity to play with nostalgia, just because sweetness is so, I think, almost woven into our DNA, a taste for sweetness. So this kind of takes us into a sort of a different level. This is something that I'm kind of personally interested in. I'm not sure that I have answers to all these questions I'm about to pose. I'm going to try to go through them very quickly, but especially living in New York and having sort of a peer group of very creative people, I'm very interested in the language of other disciplines, especially those of the arts, and how we might be able to adopt that language to cooking. And again, these are very almost intellectual exercises, but these are things I think about when I'm cooking. And when I think about art and food, it's less about making a pretty plate, about the presentation, but using these artistic languages to better construct a dish. With music, I picked a picture of Thelonious Monk here because he was known for playing the wrong notes, but that dissonance is pleasant to the ear. Writing, I think, is interesting. How do we create punctuation in a dish? Can a dish or an extended tasting menu tell a narrative, or tell a story? A lot of times we have, nowadays we see irony in food, but how can we create a metaphor with food without resorting to cuteness or irony? Hubert Selby pretty much butchered the English language in order to get his style, so I think he's an interesting example of that. Painting. I love the idea of chiaroscuro, light and dark, texture. I often sketch dishes before I actually realize them on a plate, and I think that's an interesting exercise as well. And it helps me think about not only the composition of how the things are arranged, but almost the inner architecture. Oops. Speaking of architecture, architecture can certainly be overt. If you remember back in the 90s, there was an explosion of tall food and vertical presentations. But I'm interested more in that sort of inner architecture, how things are arranged, how someone eats a particular dish. And then finally, photography. I was actually studying photography when I accidentally fell into cooking, but 20 years ago before digital. So I often equate pastry, what I do now, with photography, what I did then, in the sense that it's very technical, especially when you're doing darkroom work. Pastry is very technical. I almost think that as a pastry chef, I have to predict the future more so than savory cooks. If you're making a soup, you can tweak it and edit it along the way. For me, I have to mix something, put it in an oven, and know what's going to happen 30 minutes later. But what's in the frame or what's on the plate can kind of become the art. That's it.
Hello. So I'm Yael, and I'm the director of Umami Food Art Festival. As you can see by the name, I too have spent some years thinking about this particular question. I'll start by just talking a little bit about the festival. We started in 2008. We're a nonprofit biannual Biennale event that takes place in New York City. And what we try to do is bring together artists that use food as their medium, and I'll talk about what that means in a minute, with food professionals. And that could be growers, cooks, any kind of food professional. And we do that through a series of events, and that could be workshops, exhibits, performances, and so on. So, and panel discussions. So our sort of mission, when starting Umami was, the idea of bringing these two groups together. We kind of have a double-fold mission. One was to encourage artists whose work is grounded in everyday life and materials. We think that's an important thing. So that's kind of part of what we do by helping them, present their work and make money, as the starving artist conundrum. The second part is to encourage people to think about food in general, to think about food in a positive way, to think about food as a creative and inspiring medium. And that could be kids. We have workshops for kids, teenagers, and grown-ups. And we often feel that a lot of the anxieties and issues we have with food come from, worrying about calories and, what should I eat, what shouldn't I eat? And we're kind of skipping over the first stage of just the pleasure of food and enjoying food. And we feel that, through the art angle, we can recapture that, hopefully. So that's part of what we try to do. And the way we try to do it is through creating dialogue and through collaborative work. That's our main goal, to bring these people together. Because we too believe that, different viewpoints, getting together people that come to food from different perspectives is a way to get at new ideas, right? So I just brought some examples of our artists. This one is Diane Borsado. I just love this particular image. It's from Umami in 2010, from a project called Putting Things in My Mouth, where she basically got a chance to go into a museum of natural history and engage with the objects, not through just viewing them, but through tasting them, through putting them in her mouth. This is a visual artist, Guy Goldstein. This is from the our 2012 festival. He basically collaborated with gerbils that chewed these disposable utensils, these disposable eating vehicles, and he photographed the results. and we displayed some of that work. Tat Futan, this particular project enriched, was presented in 2012. It was made with cereal, I think mostly Fruit Loops. And he did this whole, he does a lot of environmental kind of work, and this was all about researching the nutritional value or lack thereof of these enriched cereals. There was, what you see him holding there is one of these leaf blowers. It was a lot of fun. The audience got to do a lot of that. And this is from 2008, Mimi Oka and Doug Fitch, who recently broke up their artistic partnership. They did a project called Orphic Memory Sausage, which basically invited guests to bring objects they wanted to commemorate in sausage form to the space, where everything people brought was ground up, broken up, mashed, mixed together with paper mache and stuffed into sausage skins with traditional kind of Portuguese little stuffing things as a kind of communal event. Later the sausages were hung. You can kind of see the frame on top there to dry, and the artist signed the sausages, and you got to take one home at the end of the day. All of these projects raise a lot of issues around art, the meaning of art, ephemeral work, food, in different ways. I just wanted to give very few examples. Oh, I'm sorry, last one. Miwa Koizumi's New York ice cream flavors is one of my favorite art projects with food, because she creates ice cream flavors that represent different neighborhoods in New York City. And it's not just kind of borscht flavor. The ice cream, it's ice cream made out of borscht, which is somehow different. You always get two flavors. She serves them out of this cart. So bagel and lox ice creams, borscht and sour cream ice creams. I forget curry with what, but they're always, they speak about a particular neighborhood, and group of people in New York City. And the artistic experience happens in your mouth. That's where it happens. It's all about the flavor. There's nothing else going on. So those are some examples. The last couple are from a kids project we did, which is the most elementary kind of way of working with food as art. We painted with food. We used, ground up, squeezed, squished food and spices to create paintings. We had kids basically get these squares and paint on them. And then we hung them all up in this beautiful grid, because everything looks better in a grid. This is not a very good image, but you can just get a sense of how beautiful they look, and it kind of reminds you of how beautiful food can be, these vibrant colors and textures. Which brings me to my Is Food Art bit, and I'll do this very briefly. The way I like to approach it is by thinking, when I think about food as art, until very recently, kind of in the history of what is art, how we think about art, things that were functional, things that were temporal, that disappeared, that were ephemeral, could not be art. They weren't art. And with kind of modern art, with all these new forms and mediums that we have, we had to change the way we think about art, about what could be considered as art. So today, things that are functional can be art, things that are ephemeral can be art, and so food becomes this medium that can be considered, as a medium for art. And when I think about it, I think about conceptual work. When I think of what art is to me, I think of something that makes me pause and think. So it's not about, we all know that art is not about being beautiful anymore, but for me, an art object is an object that makes me pause and think. And it doesn't have to be to think about, what is the meaning of life. It could be, as in this case, to think about what is a tomato. Because when you get that thing, I bet you never thought about a tomato in that way ever before. It forces you to reconsider the idea of tomato. And the same goes with, for Heston Blumenthal, this is just one example, Sound of the Sea, where a dish includes, sound and smells and invokes the idea, you think about the sea in a whole new way when you eat this dish, when you consume it. Or Flaming Sorbet, the idea of cold and hot. What can be cold? What can be hot? What does it mean? Or Ferran Adria's classic caviar made out of, in this particular case, melon, but it has apple caviar and so on. And they make you rethink the idea of melon. And of course, there are other, could be more complex questions, but these particular chefs are chefs that not necessarily use particular technologies, but they think conceptually. They think about spring, how can I, or about Thai food, or about tomato, and they want to share that with their audience. And to me, I feel that that's a place that's really interesting, and that these particular chefs really take the idea of food as art to a whole new place, and that really asks us to generate this whole new language and a way of thinking about food that we don't have. I mean, we're used to thinking about food as something that, does it taste good? Does it need more acid? We're not used to thinking, oh, did it make me think in a whole new way about, Thai immigrants to New York City, or about tomato? So that's kind of the my big, I think, contribution to that particular thing. And I also wanted to mention one last thing that kind of comes back to Fabio's point, the idea of chefs running a business. And I think that's essential. As we're thinking through this, one of the main differences between chefs and other artists is they can't apply for grants. They have to run a viable business. And what does that mean? Why are there so few chefs that could really do this kind of experimental or conceptual cuisine and run a business at the same time? So just another point to kind of remember as we discuss this. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nino. I'm an artist and a food photographer, and I'm here to help with this discussion about is food art. Let me try and pull up my slides. Can you all hear me okay? One of the things I'd like to do is just answer very directly the question. As a photographer, I do believe that food is not art, but that you can create art out of food, or at least in the medium of photography. There is a strong case in photography that for it being recognized as art, but I believe it is only when there is the artistic intention by the creator. And so that could also fall into the other categories as a chef, his intention creating the piece, especially what Fabio was speaking about, where you have haute cuisine and you need to reach to a certain level in order to achieve something that is artistic, whether it be food. And a lot of the times, it's been discussed in photography itself as is photography art as well, but I won't get too much into that. There's always a back and forth regarding that because it is both kind of like culinary, where the chefs work with food. Photography is both an art and a science. It was born out of science. All the the chemicals at the beginning were for making plates, and then the glass that you need to expose your film in order to create an image. Now we have digital sensors, but that is all pure science. And I think with that idea, it still falls back to the use of, I guess, either your hands if you're a chef, or in my case a photographer, I use cameras, I use lighting, I use props, and I usually have the help of a food stylist. And one of the things that is always questioned is, you want to make a representation of a particular dish, a recipe, and whatnot. And here I wanted to show some examples of food that I shoot that is very representational. I don't consider it art because my intention was not to create something artistic. My intention was to create something very literal and descriptive for the viewer. And there are other cases where I want it to be artistic. I want it to be enticing. I want the images to be very sensorial, to capture all of your senses, despite it being a two-dimensional piece of work. You weren't there. You couldn't smell the cheese melting or the flames on the barbecue. But from the picture, from the moment that I capture, you hopefully are transported to that moment. And along with the idea of photography, it's capturing the instant moment that is fleeting, usually. That cheese was very ugly after like two minutes after taking this picture, and it did not look this good initially. And oddly enough, that happens a lot with food and food photography. The food does not last, and the food is real. It's since growing into the 90s and then 2000s and the time that we are now, it's being requested more and more that food is not fake when you photograph it. You know, it's not doctored as much as you would think, except for, you know, the styling. You know, everything is prepared very intentionally. So here you have, you know, basic things such as carrots or pizza or cheese, and a lot of it is not art. But then if you try to just do something with intent, such as the grenadine and you know, the martini pourer here, you know, you can argue that it is art. Here you have just regular old popcorn. I just love popcorn, and what I wanted to do is to try to capture the moment of the feeling that I get when I, you know, make a fresh batch of popcorn, and it's hot, it's in the bowl, and then I just take my salt grinder and pour it over, and I think, you know, and then it's so much more enjoyable that way. But I was trying to catch a very intimate moment between me and my food, a relationship, and I think the chefs are also trying to get the people who are dining to have a very intimate moment in relationship with their food with every bite. I think that's fantastic when that happens, when there's a connection. So, but again, like I said, food, I believe, is not art in itself. I believe it is sustenance for all of us. It helps us move every day, but it is in the hands of an artist with intention. It becomes art. So I believe, I think one of the things I did want to show you was one of my more favorite images where you have, it's butter lettuce. That's all it is. It's butter lettuce and vinaigrette. It came from Union Square and came from nature. It didn't look like that when you bought it, but with the intention and the fleeting moment, because if you let that vinegar sit 5 more minutes, it's all soggy. It's, you know, probably not going to taste good, and it'll just wilt away. And you have this fleeting moment. You capture it, and you have something that maybe wants you to actually order that on a menu or buy it in the store, encouraging the interaction of the viewer and then the artist, the creator. Thank you.
Hi. So yeah, we are kind of going to speak as one. We are both interdisciplinary artists, and just in the past year started a company called Grim Artisanal Ales. Sorry, am I not speaking out loud enough? Grim Artisanal Ales. Artisanal.
Right, so it's Grim Artisanal Ales, not grim artists, even though we are artists. What we make as a product, we don't consider to be art, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about why. So one of the things, if you look around the room right now, you see this stuff, and everybody agrees that this is art, right? It operates by a certain logic, and it's evaluated according to a certain set of criteria that are maybe arguably old-fashioned criteria.
So we thought we would start our talk with Mondrian. Very formalist. When you critique this artwork, you're critiquing it based on a set of criteria that's purely perceptual. There's a certain kind of distance between the viewer and the piece of artwork. You say that it has nice colors, it has movement, it has you know, a certain kind of balance, and those are all formalist qualities.
It's the same sort of thing that we talk about when we talk about a really good dish, right? We talk about how the flavors play against each other, or, you know, how the movement from the aroma moves into the experience of taste that you have over time. Things like these are formalist judgments of food, right? But we thought maybe instead of getting too deep with that, why don't we look also at the way that artists have used food? Because I think that it's actually served a different function within art.
So this is from the 60s. It's Carolee Schneeman's Meat Joy, and she basically gave a bunch of participants, it was, a performance piece. They have, sausages, chicken, fish, and it's a 60s, kind of crazy performance piece. But clearly, the idea here is to question the kind of establishment of art throughout history, to question that kind of formalist nature that you see in a piece like Mondrian.
Alan Capro, this is a piece called Women Licking Jam Off of a Car. Again, it's the use of food to undermine or challenge the received notion of formalism as the appropriate way to evaluate art. This is not beautiful in the conventional sense. It's somehow about the act of nominating the thing that you're doing as being art. That nomination is where the art resides, right?
And, you're in the traditional formalist sense of artwork, you do think about the art materials being, paint, marble, traditional mediums. And when these artists started to use found objects, mass-produced objects, and food in their work, it was for a very different idea. They're definitely appropriating these, quote-unquote, non-art objects to make artwork in order to question the history of art.
And to take art down a few notches in a way, right? It's like art has become this thing that's elevated, it's on the wall, and you don't touch it. It was a way of saying, no, art is the everyday. Art isn't part of this class-based game of status, necessarily. It's a utopian idea.
So now getting more into the present, one of my favorite artists, Janine Antoni, had this piece called Lick and Lather, and you can see in this it's has a lot of formalist qualities. She has taken the traditional bust, which is her own image, and the white ones are made out of soap, and then the brown ones are made out of chocolate. So she basically licked the busts made of chocolate and bathed with the soap busts. Again, this is questioning the inherent formalism that's a part of artwork, and by the use of food and soap. Sophie Calle, as well, a French artist. She is a photographer, but she does a lot of performance-based work as well. So this piece, she basically ate a chromatic diet for a week. And
actually, Paul Auster wrote a novel. They spoke, and she said, well, write a novel in which I'm an artist and
with a character.
With a character, right, who does things. And then she did the things that Paul Auster wrote that the artist would do. And this is, so he wrote in the book about this piece, and so she made it. And every day of the week, she ate a different color.
And when you look at this, you think, wow, that looks so formalist, but the action outside of the, the photographic frame is what totally changes the work.
It's a parody of formalism. It's a critique of formalism, and it's it's undermining those traditions of art from within, right? It looks like art, which is part of the joke.
Again, Felix Gonzalez-Torres, wonderful artist. He made a lot of portraits in candy of himself and his friends, and this was the exact weight of his lover in candy form, and participants in the gallery, well, his lover died of AIDS, and the participants
like a memorial
in the gallery are offered, you can take a piece of candy and eat it. And so it's very much talking about death, but
also implicating the audience or the viewer. You take a piece of candy and you're eating it, you're sort of in some spiritual way, like removing a piece of that body, and it's, you know, it's a little bit of a poisoned gift, right? The gift of this candy.
But you can see it's also in the realm of art. You look at this and it has a lot of formal qualities, but it's that action and participation of the audience that breaks that formalism.
So that sort of brings us to this, you know, new era of highly formalist food, right? I think that what Lauren and I want to say about it is that this food resembles the art of the early 20th century, right? It's like aspiring to this situation where everything has an aesthetic distance and is appreciated purely on this sort of sensory level.
You're judging it based on its composition, the color, the arrangement, the flavors, and those are very formal qualities, which is a really different way than of using food than those artists that we just went through who actually use food in their artwork.
If you were to go to an art school today and use the sort of justifications that high-end chefs use for, you know, their decision making, and use that to describe your art, you would not get a pass. You can't get away with a purely aesthetic rationale anymore.
Well, you can. You would just be highly critiqued.
Sure, yeah. It's just, it's not where art is anymore. So, you know.
So I think, yeah, I mean, one of the, when I thought about this question, I thought about the difference between, you know, that like history of art and breaking boundaries and using food to break down boundaries, and that the formalist food that you see at a restaurant like Alinea is not ingrained in that same dialogue of anti-formalism.
Right. Another way to think about the question is food art? Sure, it can be art, just as anything can be art if you say it is. But what do you gain from calling it art, right? What you get when you say this food is art is you have to contend with a whole other set of evaluating criteria that basically remove a lot of the good things about what makes it food or good food and replace it with a lot of other stuff that you might not want in your food. I mean, we want our art to be able to be things like poisonous or, you know, things that you wouldn't want to eat,
yeah.
right? And we don't want our food to be disgusting, even though we might say Carolee Schneeman's Meat Joy is great. It would be a sad thing for food if we say food is art, and then we had to give up the simple criteria of like deliciousness and nourishment that everyone has always appreciated and loved. So that's why when we make what we make, we're really happy, even though we're artists, to be able to have a chance to make something that is just delicious. It's a great frickin' beer. And it's a relief to us to not think about it according to, you know, these art historical dialogic rationales, and just think about making great food.
So we have a lot of things to think about. I'd like to ask some of our other panelists to comment on that question of whether really this is a smart thing to do. Do we want to talk about food as art, and does it really matter? Want to start?
For me, does it work? No. It works? Okay, I'm sorry. For me, it's not so much as do we want. For me, the interesting question as, you know, somebody who studied the history and culture of food is, why are we here talking about food as art? Is it something new? Is it something that was done before? And why do we speak of food as art or food as non-art at different moments? Why in the 60s and the 70s it was so important to go against this concept of formal art? Well, now we're sort of going back to that. What are the historical reasons? But also, again, for me, it's very important to understand how artists, clients, patrons, the environment work with each other. So for me, that is an important question, but not so much to answer is food art or not. I don't know if it's possible to answer, and personally, it's not the most important question, but it's why now? What does it say about us as a society in this specific moment of time?
Anybody else want to weigh in on that? Yes.
For me, hello.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I definitely don't think all food is art. I mean, sometimes a sandwich is just a sandwich. But I think some food can be art, and some chefs do think of their food, maybe not as art per se, but they think in those terms. And we should thank them, help them, support them by creating a dialogue around that and ways to think about food as more than just, is it delicious, is it nutritious? I think we kind of owe that to people that try to create these new things with food. So the short answer is not all of it, but some of it.
Okay, anybody else want to?
I guess, you know, on the one hand, totally, I'm like, yeah, it's great to think of food as more than just, I'm hungry and now let's eat. But at the same time, I think it gets into a kind of class distinctions. I mean, when you are able to consume food at one of these, amazing restaurants and consume the food that's viewed as art and that has all of these, amazing qualities, you are of a different class than, the person who is consuming food because it's, provides nourishment. And so not everybody is able to partake in food as art, but actually maybe that's like Umami Festival.
Well, or maybe that's the thing we want to change then. If chefs could get grants, maybe more people could experience that kind of food, right?
Well, Pierre Bourdieu, I don't know if anybody's familiar with his work, wrote a lot about why people who come from different walks of life exhibit different kinds of taste. And he wrote a book that has just demolished the art world from the inside in terms of the way people think about things, called Distinction, where he just like systematically tears down all the taste preferences of people by class, and he actually writes about food in a very critical way. He says, and we saved this quote because we thought it was so great, the antithesis between quantity and quality, substance and form, corresponds to the opposition, linked to different distances from necessity, between the taste of liberty, or luxury, which shifts the emphasis to the manner of presenting, serving, eating, and tends to use stylized forms to deny function. And he links that to an upper class pattern of food appreciation and eating that is used by the eater to set themselves apart from others. And I think that that's what we see in certain kinds of very visually complex food arrangements is something about a desire to set oneself apart from others and above others through the use of formalism, which is really maybe a reactionary thing that we had in art and still have, and some of us who are artists are still fighting.
But isn't it also possible to have some of the simplest food be art? I mean, you can have a gelato or something like that that a person can afford, even not going to Alinea or whatever, and have that be, can that rise to art? That's really part of what I'm asking. Or you know, does it matter if it tastes good? So, yes.
As soon as you mentioned gelato, you know, I guess with food, it instantly transports me back to a time, you know, nostalgia. And to kind of answer that directly a little bit, a personal experience when I was growing up, it was Al Gelato was a ice cream parlor where I grew up in Los Angeles. And Richard, the owner, had created a rose ice gelato. Well, it wouldn't be gelato because it didn't have ice cream, but you know, rose ice. And it didn't sell well. It was my favorite ice there. It was delicate, light, airy, fluffy, and just anything. It was just heaven. And it died. It was there for like maybe a few months, and it was gone away, and I bugged him forever, and I still bug him today to give me the recipe. But you know, that, I believe, was something along the lines of he was creating something very artistic and for a whole experience for his customers. But I guess with culture, it wasn't the time for them to appreciate it. There was not yet the flavor, the cultural flavor had not been developed, exactly. So it died away. And yet it was such a hard and difficult ice to make. This rose ice he told me about, just making sure the extract of the petals was exact. If not, it didn't work. The way he churned it, the way he formed it, otherwise it would just fall apart. It would taste really bad. And it was a very laborious thing, so he gave up on it because it wasn't popular. Unfortunate, but
well, I think what's interesting about that is that if that were served to a clientele that was, say, from the Indian subcontinent, it would be nostalgic flavor for them. I mean, rose is not, it may be for our Western palate. So, you know, to me, I mean, I agree with a lot of the ideas of the limitations of food as art. I certainly believe in the class distinctions. I think some of the most popular or the most well-regarded restaurants in the world, they're so restrictive just to get into. You know, I think they're actually starting to redefine what a restaurant is. It speaks to, like, are you familiar with Favaken in Sweden? Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe a few dozen people eat there in the course of a year, so yet it's still ranked as one of the top 5 restaurants in the world. So I think that's interesting. But what interests me is that as a chef is purely the process. And talking about that sense of nostalgia, you know, I was just talking about this last night in a discussion where one of the most nostalgic flavor combinations for me is apple cider and cinnamon donuts. I grew up in the Midwest. This time of year, it's common to go to a cider mill, fresh pressed cider, warm cinnamon donut. I probably only had that experience 4 or 5 times in my life, but that combination immediately brings back this sense memory. So in a sense, every apple dessert I make, for me personally, it's channeling that, although the other 5 of you probably wouldn't get that. But hopefully I'm maybe tapping into your grandmother's apple pie or something similar. So for me, there's almost always a story behind a dish. It's not always appropriate to tell that story, to understand that story, but I think it's really integral to the process.
So I want to open this up to the audience, and we are filming this, so please wait until somebody comes around with the microphone before you ask the question. But do any of you, yes? Mm-hmm.
Thank you all very much. I guess my question for you is, at what point is food art, for those of you that think food is art? I'm coming from, I guess, a bit of a different background. I am a food scientist. During college, and I don't think I know what art is. During college, I happened to be taking a food engineering and sculpture class at the same time, and there was an amazing amount of overlap to me in these two classes. So when I think about food and art, I oftentimes think about on the farm and growing and when you're processing and how you're processing, or if you're slaughtering a cow, or how you're putting ingredients in together. So I was curious if you all thought that part of food related to art and not just the finished dishes and putting things together in an attractive way. Thank you.
I'd say food is art whenever there's an artist who declares that it is, and it's as simple as that. But the question of whether that food is good art or bad art will have nothing to do with the kind of evaluation that you would usually bring to bear for food, like, is it yummy? When you call it art, you're taking it out of one context and one set of criteria and putting it into an entirely different one, in which those previous criteria are no longer apply.
There's an interesting philosophical point of view in terms of things that are grown from the earth or anything that is from nature is art, can be artistic. You know, it's less an Occidental view than anything, and it's a very spiritual point of view. So it's still a subjective point of view when it comes down to it. But I find it very interesting, the idea of, you know, when there are foods that, say, are cross-pollinated and grown in certain manners to, you know, resist certain, you know, bugs and diseases and whatnot. Those you could technically call them the works of art when they come to a certain fruition, a certain work and intent by even a scientist. I think certain scientists are artists in their own ways because they have to think on many different aspects, many different levels in order to come to conclusions, you know, to work through their hypotheses and whatnot. And there are a lot of many happy accidents, which also we as artists, we experience those happy accidents, and that really changes everything at that point.
I just want to say there are quite a few contemporary artists that do really exciting work with growing, you know, from that side, coming with artists training and so on, and exploring not the cooking or eating and consumption kind of point in the chain, but growing in many different areas, especially quite a group of feminist kind of people that are interested in women's issues, exploring growing and as a medium. So there's a lot of interesting work coming to explore that. Mm.
Did you have your hand up? Yeah.
Hi, thank you all. Okay. I was kind of wondering more about the food stylist aspect that you had mentioned. As someone that does do food styling, I agreed about the photograph itself being art once you take that time and that artistic vision to make it into a photograph. But then the more I thought about it, a food stylist gets so involved in crafting a skillet, you know, painting on oil, using tweezers, really exacting a picture of what that food needs to look like. So I just wondered if anyone had any comments on what a food stylist, where that falls on the spectrum of art and science.
Well, I guess from a photographer's point of view, I think it's still a blend between the two. You are a scientist, an artist, and very skilled, you know, craftsman in a way, in order to achieve that look and feel that is, one, being requested by a client, and two, being collaborated on by an entire team. It doesn't take one person to make some of those photos. It's, you know, 4 or 5 people. And how you build that and how the light falls on it and how the composition of plating and surface and environment are all brought together, that intention creates that artistic or art piece of art. But you can argue also where it's not. It's just science. You're making things, you're painting things, you're tweezing and manicuring, and in the end, someone will not call it art. And but they can. You know, there's nothing wrong with that. I think everyone is able to have their opinion one way or another, and you know, we try not to get too offended.
Well, I'll just add that in pretty much any Michelin 3-star level restaurant, that you usually have 3 or 4 people over a single dish with tweezers and whatnot to get that plate just right. Alinea, I think the cook to guest ratio is about 1-to-1, and that's pretty common at that level. So that work does go into it at that a la minute sort of moment.
And for me, looking at from a historical point of view, it's not so much what's there and what it's done that's, you know, what is art and what is craft, but the perception of art and craft changes over time. So things that now are considered art, all the things we're describing, until 50 years ago were just a craft. And so many young people didn't want to become chefs because it was not considered a very, I don't know, high-end job, while now it's very prestigious. So it's difficult for me to say it's art or craft. It's art of craft when and in which context. So right now we have a specific idea of what's craft and what's art when it comes to food. Maybe in 20 years, also the perception will change about that.
Yes?
It seems to me when you're talking about art, food being art at the moment, when the artist says it's art, that there's a distinction with food in that it is always ephemeral and it's most of the time something that we consume, whereas while there are certain contemporary artists who intentionally make ephemeral art that you can consume, like the piece you showed, food is always that way. And then that makes me wonder, is it not then the perception of the eater of whether the food is art or not, rather than the chef? Because you can have someone come to one of Michael's desserts and they say, oh, this is a delicious apple whatever, I really enjoy eating this, and I don't, nostalgic or not. Or you could have someone come really looking for that technical experience, that artistic experience. And so I'm asking, is it not maybe the perception of the eater as opposed to the chef?
I mean, to me, that seems like it's, runs throughout just art in general. I mean, whether it's food or anything, when it's called art, there's always the viewer is coming at that piece with a different cultural background or different knowledge or a different definition for art, and the artist and the viewer are always going to have a distinction between them, creating that juxtaposition.
It's the overall context, right? I mean, when something is placed in a context, that brings a set of ways of thinking about it. And so, yes, if the viewer or the eater is thinking about it as art, then that's all you need, as long as the context exists in that.
It also
Right.
raises interesting questions about the role of the critic. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's so strange just because there's a whole world, like the culinary world is vast, and there's a sense of success and failure, and somebody was saying that chefs, nobody wanted to be a chef 40 years ago, but now due to the recognition you do want to be a chef as a career choice, and it's due to the establishment of a culinary world with a certain criteria for judgment, and yeah, there's, you know, so many different ways of coming at this question, I guess.
I would say that a lot of our artist friends are like, screw this, I'm going to make cheese.
I think also a lot of it is about not just do I think about this in art, but did it make me think, period. Like, and that could be about the intent of the chef or not, but it's not, as a diner, did this particular object I interacted with or consumed, was it just delicious, period? Or did it make me think about something? Did it make me feel something? And that's what art should do, right? Obviously, there's the good and bad art as well, and it's the same in the realm of food, but did it make me think or feel? And the problem is that we don't have the vocabulary to talk about it. We don't sit around the table and say, oh, you know, that plate was so interesting, you know. We don't have the words. We don't have the way as diners to discuss it. And sometimes we should, like we miss that, right? We have a lot of words to talk about how delicious it was, but we don't have a vocabulary to talk about what it made us feel and think, you know, how food made us feel and think, you know, so it kind of causes really interesting questions, you know, as a diner, you know, when you think about diners' reactions.
And to develop Liz's point, the relationship between the eater and the cook, the chef, the preparer, now it's very much filtered. She mentioned the critic. Very much the critic somehow guides the perception of what can be art or what cannot be art, what's good, what's bad. But now we're moving also beyond the figure of the critic as the expert with authority and with credentials. And it's being diffused and diluted among all the people that can show up at the restaurant and take a picture and say, okay, this is really interesting, this is art. And so it's not just the eater and the person that prepares the food, it's much more complicated. That's why before I used the term of a social field, because it's a lot of interactions determine, you know, who eats, who prepares, what's art, what's craft, and it changes all the time.
And we've also been talking very much about visual arts. And if we think about music or something like that that is as ephemeral as food, that also makes us think about it yet in another way, because the food has to be consumed in order to be appreciated. And the music is gone once you've listened to it. So there's, you know, it's well, yes, unless it's recorded, but then it's not the same experience. Food, of course, you can't even do that with. It's just gone unless they start replicating it now on...
Well, one of my favorite chefs, Pierre Gagnère, in Paris, years and years ago, I read something that he wrote where he likened cooking a lot to jazz because there was this fleeting quality. No performance was ever exactly the same twice. And early on, he's since, of course, written a few cookbooks, but early on, that viewpoint made him think that you couldn't actually write a recipe, which I think is interesting. And it's also the question that was raised earlier about, you know, where does the product or the growing of the product fit in? I mean, to me, it's the medium. It's as if it were, you know, a tube of paint or a piece of marble. And that indeterminate also makes me think, one concept that I think a lot about, that I think applies to food really well, is this Japanese concept of wabi-sabi, which is sort of the art of imperfection, of change, of impermanence. And I think you kind of, whether it's conscious or not, I think you see that in a lot of, like right now, Scandinavia is hot. And I think coupled with sort of a Scandinavian aesthetic and Scandinavian ingredients, I think you're seeing that kind of, you know, kind of Eastern aesthetic expressed in the food there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, back there. Mm-hmm. Whichever one you can get to.
Hi. Well, I wanted to comment on that because I've always loved interactive art. It makes me feel more connected to it, maybe because I just like to interact and, you know, get my emotion in that way. But I think it's interesting that food, at least the food that is art that is meant to be consumed, is the only medium in which it really, you internalize it, and I mean that in a physical way, like it enters your body and you assume it in your body. So I guess what I'm wondering is, how do you draw a parallel between artists who mean their food to be consumed and artists who do not? And are we maybe giving chefs a label that they don't want by calling them an artist?
I think if you were to poll chefs, I think most people would not say they're artists. They would firmly plant the, cooking as a craft. For me personally, I just think it's an interesting question. I go back and forth on whether I'm an artist or not. I don't know. And I think, like I mentioned before, to get to that point, you have to overcome so many hurdles: the economic, the physical hurdles. You have to master all those things to find that very narrow space where it can possibly become art.
I mean, I think the question comes from a very Western, point of view. The question of whether something is art or isn't is just so ingrained in, I don't know, our culture of separating art from life, and so I feel like I'm, answering it within that framework of a Western point of view. But it's like also when you go to many other places, art and life are much more intertwined, and so I think it's just an interesting question. Like within a Western framework, there's an answer, and then that answer doesn't always hold up when you leave this cultural background.
So let's take one more question. Sure, right there.
I just want to add something. As a food writer and as a food photographer, it depends on the country, in my opinion, because different countries consider food a different form of art. In Spain, for instance, the wineries and the chefs that are working with the winemakers are now working with the most famous architects in Spain to create the art and architecture of both the wine and the winery. So it appears to me that there is no answer because there is no question, because art is really in the eyes of the beholder or the diner or the chef, and art is what you make it. And whether it's now with the famous architects in Spain who are working with the most famous chefs in Spain, it's bringing beauty in the making, in the observing, in the photographing, and certainly in the eating and the drinking.
Well, I don't know if we need any more comments then. I want to thank all of you. I want to thank all of our wonderful panelists. I think we've had a really great discussion. We are going to have the culmination of this exploration on October 10th in New Orleans. Ken Albala is going to be presenting his thoughts on this question. So if anybody's going to be in New Orleans in October, I recommend that you come by, because I think it's going to be quite interesting.
The video of this panel will be available on the Inquisitive Eater. Inquisitive Eater, inquisitive, somebody who doesn't have an accent, maybe.
Inquisitive. Inquisitive, INQUISITI.
Eater.
Eater.
One word. Inquisitiveeater.com. And thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you from the New School, New York University, and the Southern Food and Beverage Museum.
Thanks to everybody.